This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome everyone back to the first interview for the Blackwater Rabbit of 2023. And this is the Invisible Architecture interview series. And I am Carol Assa, and I am blessed to have Laird Scranton back for a second interview. Hi, Laird.
Hey, Carol. How are you today?
I'm doing great. It's great to have you back. So Laird is a world-renowned scholar who focuses mainly on cultures around 3200 BC. And he's written, and I left that blank. How many books have you written by now?
Well, we're in the editing phase right now for the 14th book.
Wow, I didn't know. So
shortly it'll be 14 books.
14 books, okay. And this year I bought the Chinese cosmology book, so I was thinking maybe we would start with that. And reading it, I found it was interesting how it closely related to Dogon, Egyptian, and the cultures that you study, that you write about. So we were just talking about, like, when you're doing the all of the Chinese bagwas and the Tai Chi symbol and all of the things they use for their astrology, feng shui, their medicine, the south is always at the top. And so did any other cultures have the south at the top?
Yes, that's an archaic viewpoint. The ancient Egyptians treated directionality that way, that up for the ancient Egyptians was south and down was north. That's true in other cultures also, and sort of midway through the last 12,000 years, which I consider to be a half cycle, there are reversals in symbolism that happen. And the reason for that is a little bit tricky to understand. There's the outlook is that there is energy that scrolls between two domains, causing one of them to become progressively less material and the other one become progressively more material.
Okay.
So over time, what happens is that's like an hourglass where you have sand in the top globe that filters down into the bottom globe. When you start out, all the sand's at the top. Midway through, you have equal amounts of sand both places, and towards the end, you have all the sand at the bottom. So any symbolism that's used to represent our domain in one era is not appropriate in another era. Symbolism that applies to non-materiality or to energetics is different than symbolism that applies to materiality. And so midway through the cycle, all the cultures have to switch their symbols. I compare it to taking a cross-country flight and realizing when you get to your destination, you have to change your watch by 3 hours. Now, you probably don't know anybody else on the flight, but everybody on the plane is going to change their watch.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened in the world, is at around the same time, everybody changed their symbols.
Wow. So like with this south for the, within the Chinese, it was like, is that 3200 or earlier that started?
Well, the problem in China is that they have a problem with textual representation of what happened. All the written texts are from a much later era. So that creates all sorts of arguments among the scholars as to what was actually true. You don't have a text from 3000 BC saying here's what was going on. You have a text at 300 BC. And so that complicates things in China. But I can tell you that we have direct comparability between certain ancient Egyptian symbolism and certain Chinese symbolism. For example, I know that certain words in both languages, hieroglyphic words, were formulated exactly the same way and read the same way. Mm-hmm. So it's easy to make the argument that it's all the same system. The first evidence we have of the system comes out of southeast Turkey, which is sort of equidistant between Egypt and China.
Oh, is that where Göbekli Tepe is?
That's where Göbekli Tepe is, right?
Oh, I see. Okay. Wow.
One of the translations for Göbekli Tepe, the name, is Central Hill. Central Hill was also the meaning of the Greek term, where they would place their temples on top of hilltops.
Oh, can you just say that you broke up? Can you just say that again? They would place their
temples on centrally located hilltops, and they used the suffix opolis to represent that, Central Hill.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, then the whole thing, when I was looking at like with the, within the Chinese, they have like two Bhagwas. They have the archetypal, and then they have the manifested one. So,
right.
And they're totally laid out differently, you know. So do they have anything like any kind of symbols like that in the other cultures that you see?
Yes, in Buddhism, it's represented that their quote unquote most sacred symbols are referred to as a class of symbols called adequate symbols. And adequate symbols are defined as a shape that can't lose its meaning no matter what happens with the initiates who understand it. And the reason it can't lose its meaning is because the shape inheres in nature, and any technological culture that can see the shape automatically understands the symbolism of the shape because it goes along with the shape. It's like the shape of an electron orbit with a hydrogen atom, that if you see a representation of that, it's very difficult to misunderstand what's being represented.
Okay.
And so there's a certain class of symbols that are of that category, and then another class of symbols that are more mnemonic. You know, someone chose this thing to represent this concept.
Because I always thought of symbols sort of as analogies, but I see.
Yes,
but there's
a symbol is an excellent way to represent a concept. Right. And from the perspectives of the cultures I'm studying, symbols take their meanings ultimately from a non-material realm. That what's being represented originates there, and we sort of have the use of it. It comes down to basics of energetics.
It's interesting, like with the feng shui and how it's all set up within China, no matter which school you're with, the south on the top and the Bhagavad, that in India they had Vastu Shastra, which was the feng shui of India, but they had the north on the top. I was just thinking that as you were going through this. And they had the center, like the center for the feng shui is when you do it on the Bhagavad, that's an energy that's like non-human, you know. And,
right.
And they had Rama. Yeah.
Now we can think of the Hebrew calendar as marking sort of the midpoint of the half cycle we just finished.
Okay.
It's approximately 6,000 years ago, and an approximate 12,000 year half cycle. And so that's sort of the flipping point where you start seeing matriarchy supplanted by patriarchy, or you see, prior to 3600 BC, structures are traditionally built with a round base because circularity is appropriate to the idea of energetics and to a spiritual domain, and squareness is appropriate to materiality.
Right.
And so after 3600 BC, slowly you start to see cultures building structures with square bases rather than round ones.
So is this like a 6,000 year cycle that continues?
6,000 year sort of quarter cycle. It's a 25,000 year total cycle.
Okay.
This is a yuga cycle.
Right.
A 12,000 year half cycle.
Cycles. Okay.
Right. Now the number I like, there are various numbers given for the length of the half cycle, depending on what source you look at. The one I like best is 12,920 years. That all of the ancient units of measure, the 360-day year, the 12-month year, the 30-day month, and so on, in ancient times a 10-day week, these are all even factors of that number. And so it makes sense if someone was setting up a system of measure for us or helping us set up one, that they would base it on even factors of the largest cycle that we experience.
So this 10-day week, I know that I've way back listening to you, that you found it like with the Egyptians had it, and then the
Ancient Chinese had it.
The Chinese had it. And so
Right.
did the Indians have it? India?
I'm not aware of whether they did or not. I know the Dogon right now celebrate a 5-day week, which
Oh.
again is an even factor.
Mm.
And at some point along the line, cultures made the choice to switch to a 7-day week. I'm not sure in India whether they ever actually observed a 10-day week or not.
Oh, can you tell just the viewers like how you discovered that? It's an amazing one with the sun and the hieroglyphic.
Well, okay. My entry point into all this material is through a tribe called the Dogon. They're a modern day primitive priestly African tribe from Mali. And their societal imperative is to preserve original meanings of these ancient myths and symbols and words. Mm-hmm. And Dogon culture is kind of umbrella over many different cultures. They have aspects that are like ancient Egypt, like ancient Buddhism. They have rituals like ancient Judaism. They have symbolism that directly relates to Hinduism. And they have words that predictably compare to ancient Egyptian words and sometimes to Hebrew words. So the Dogon culture makes an excellent starting point for trying to compare these things back and forth. Well, I knew from Dogon language that every Dogon word is made up of syllables that represent what I call root concepts. And they sort of mix and match those root concepts to build larger concepts. Mm-hmm. And so you can tell, just if you know the pronunciation of a Dogon word, you can predict what the Dogon word means. And the same is true with Egyptian hieroglyphs, that every glyph relates to a concept. And if you substitute concepts for the glyphs that are used to spell a word, you produce a sentence that explains the meaning of the word to you. The same was true in ancient China. At 500 BC, Confucius was loudly complaining because he could no longer count on ancient Chinese words to do that. And he saw it as a great loss. Mm-hmm. So if I had had perfect knowledge trying to understand Egyptian hieroglyphs, I would have started with a word for week. Like we've been talking about the numbers of days of a week. The Egyptian word for week is written with 2 glyphs, which makes it a very simple word. The first glyph is the sun glyph, which is a circle with a dot, and it can represent the concept of a day. And the second glyph is an upside down U in English. It's the Egyptian number 10. And so I looked at the word and I said, symbolically, that word conveys the idea of 10 days to me. And I went and I did some research and discovered a fact I didn't know before, which is that the Egyptians had a 10-day week. I thought, wow, the simple form of the word just taught me something factual that I didn't know. Mm-hmm. I wonder if any other ancient Egyptian words work that way. Then it turns out they all work that way. So in ancient China, the word for week was originally formulated that exact same way, that it used the sun glyph, which originally was circular with a dot, and then the Chinese number 10, and they were observing a 10-day week. So we have direct head-to-head comparability between the formulation of that ancient Egyptian word and the ancient Chinese word. And so we know we're on firm ground when we say, look, at these traditions came out of the same body of knowledge. Wow. Now, another way we know that they came out of the same body of knowledge is that an ancient agricultural plan in China was called the Wellfield Plan. It's controversial, again, like everything else in China, that some scholars are saying, well, this was never actually implemented. It was just theoretical. But the Dogon tribe, who are my starting point, this is the basis for all their agriculture. And it's a direct match for the Chinese Wellfield Plan. And they're both called Wellfield Plans. The idea is that they have 9 plots of land that make up a square, and the center plot becomes a well that's shared communally by 8 families that farm the 8 other plots. Mm-hmm. As it turns out, that is a biological concept. It turns out that arrangement is the most efficient way to distribute energy inside a living cell.
Yeah. Wow. And so, and it's also the magic square of Saturn.
Right. And so there are a lot of different things that end up tying into that same symbolism. But that's one of the factors that, again, says to us, it's a signature. It says what was happening in ancient China is a match for the things I'm exploring with the Dogon and with the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm. And so another thing that I about with the Chinese is the symbol of, I had it down here, but I don't know if I'll show it. It's the Nuwa and Fusi, the androgyny, the male and female. Maybe I'll show it because it'll make more when we go through it. I have it on my desktop, so let's do that.
These are the creator deities of the Shang dynasty at around 1700 BC. Nuwa, who is the mother goddess, is holding calipers or that are used to draw a circle, because circularity is the native mode of energy.
Like a compass, right?
Like a compass, right. And Fuxi is holding an architectural square because squareness is the attribute of, electricity moves in linear ways, not in circular ways. And it's magnetism that induces electricity to move circularly.
I just thought it was so amazing that the parallel with the compass and square with the Masons too.
Right. Now, all the way along here, even from the Göbekli Tepe era, which is around 9000 BC, we find symbolic elements that manage to survive in one culture or another. And so we have a way of inferring what the symbolism, the original symbolism was of that element. And then we can confirm that against other cultures that had the same symbols. And this is one that survived in the Masonic tradition. But the reason why circularity and squareness becomes important to the energetics, what's trying to be described here in these symbols is the dynamics of how energy work. And when you get to the bottom of the system, you have a continuum of energy that moves from one state to another extreme state, sort of like during the year the sun moves from one solstice to the other solstice. Mm-hmm. Energy moves from a state of superconductivity, where the geometry is circular, to a state of what's called superinsulation, where the geometry is square. With superconductivity, magnetism is dormant and electricity flows unresisted. Uh-huh. At the other extreme, electricity is dormant and magnetic flux is unresisted. And so
makes it also clear. Yeah, go on.
So the oscillation of energy is back and forth persistently between those two states. At any level you want to look at it all the way up the scale, it's this oscillation from a circular configuration to a squared configuration. And that's why any symbol that reconciles the shape of a circle with the shape of a square is important to the tradition.
So now, did they, do other cultures have, this is like this androgynous couple, do others have symbols like that?
Yes, they do. Now, if you're trying to convey this is the essential problem, that whoever put the system together, presumably back, almost 12,000 years ago, was trying to represent some very deep scientific concepts through symbols and through myths and through rituals and through words. Mm-hmm. But this is a system that's only going to be ultimately understood by a technologically capable audience. So whoever's sitting there at a time where they had hunters and gatherers around them, presumably not scientists with microscopes,
right,
had to aim their symbolism way far out into the future and try to sort of guess what metaphors are going to resonate thousands of years from now with an audience that we don't know who they are. Mm-hmm. And so that was the ultimate challenge. They, in my estimation, they did an excellent job of representing things redundantly. If they had a series of metaphors to represent these things. If they don't get it if I talk about it in terms of how a plant grows, maybe they'll get it if I talk about stages of water or maybe they'll get it if I talk about stages of constructing and building, or they take the same information and repeat it in terms of fairly long list of different metaphors, hoping that one of those is going to resonate with that future audience.
Oh, that's the guy. So back to the Dogons, I remember like you with their draw, when they would draw things because they don't have a language and they draw in the dirt, that you would show
Right.
how that one time they drew, how that could be so many different things.
Right. The Dogon by choice don't have a written language for the same reasons that Socrates didn't like written language. He was against it. Socrates felt that written language was a way for a person who didn't thoroughly understand a subject to represent that they did.
Oh.
Now, we know we had centuries and centuries where the predominant mode was an apprentice system where somebody who had mastered a critical skill would teach it one-on-one with a student who would then master it also. It's a very effective way of conveying knowledge intact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the Dogon system is essentially an apprentice system that an initiate in their symbolic tradition works with an informant, very much the same way that an apprentice works with a master,
Mm-hmm.
trying to learn a carving skill or a woodworking skill or whatever it might be.
Right.
So since the Dogon imperative is to try to preserve original forms, they had an additional motive for not adopting a written language. They're trying to represent things the way they were originally and not let it move too far off that original mark.
Okay. So, and you had said that you, I think you said that you thought that they had come from Egypt, or that that you said like cultures would send groups of people
Yes.
out to preserve the culture.
Yes. First with the Dogon, we can tell from their language that they've had interesting set of migrations. Their language is technically unclassifiable because it includes 18 subsets of words from other languages, including the Turkish language, the Dravidian languages of the Tamil. There are words there that are ancient Egyptian words, words that are Hebrew words. There are 18 different subgroupings of words that the Dogon are very careful to preserve. So you could almost trace a migration for the tribe based on that.
Yeah.
But one of the traditions around 3000 BC was every so often to send a priestly group out into the wilderness, a group that had mastered skills of being able to survive in remote areas. They would deliberately send these groups out to some very remote site, almost as if to make a backup copy of a tradition the way we would with a set of computer files today. The Dogon themselves look like that kind of a tradition because they're located 8 hours drive across desert from anything that you or I would consider to be civilized.
They're like the Wayback Machine.
Right. Now, in China, there was a similar group called the Naki or the Naxi, whose language was the foundation for later written language in China. And they're from the borderland between Tibet and China.
Oh.
They preserve a language called the Dangba language.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hieroglyphic language. And the Naki are understood traditionally to have been Black African. In fact, the word Na in that region came to mean black.
Mm-hmm.
And the figure that is used in the Dangba language to represent the Naki themselves is a stick figure with a round head where everything's been blackened in.
Wow.
Similarly, in ancient Egypt, an ancient name for Egypt was Kem, which also meant black.
Uh-huh.
So these priestly groups the Naki look as if they were one of those groups that were deliberately sent out to a very remote region.
Mm-hmm.
And looks like they ended up influencing Chinese culture in various ways.
Are they still, do they still exist?
Yes, they do. As a matter of fact, I have a nephew who spent a couple of years with the Peace Corps teaching teaching English in China.
Uh-huh.
And he managed to come up with some excellent Dongba English dictionaries for me to work from.
Oh, that's great. Wow. So the other thing, well, this could go so many directions, but on this picture, just while I have it here, Nuwa, I always found because she was in charge of all of the waters and the floods and all of that sort of thing. And I thought it was always so interesting how it's like Noah, her name. And then that would relate it to the Hebrews, right?
Right. Now, the Dogon language is based on these syllables that I say represent root concepts. These are cosmological syllables. And Nu in the Dogon language and in the ancient Egyptian language and some other languages implies the concept of water and of energy. So again, you can tell from the name and the formulation of the name in China that it was based on the same system.
And then like with Fusi, does that go for then more the earth and the land?
Yes. Now the xi in Fuxi is the same suffix as the Naki or Naxi. It's KH, transliterated as KHI or XI. But the pure cosmological term is Sakai, Skhai. In ancient Egypt, that means to celebrate a festival. And for the Dogon, their most significant festival of the Sirius stars is called the Sigi festival. It means to celebrate. Now, the Fuxi also, that name also reflects a naming convention that identifies these tribal groups. That any tribal group that was influenced by this tradition declared a sort of major subject the same way we do in college or in a university. That, and then they named their tribe for that, whatever that aspect of the cosmology was that they specialized in. And so the Naki or Naxi puts that word celebrates on the end of the syllable Na, which is a term for the non-material feminine energy.
Right.
Okay. There are variations on that. You have the Amazighi tribes in North Africa. Ama is the Dogon creator god, and the Ziggy part, it means to celebrate. In Judaism, you had the original tribal name was Yahuda, which means praises Yah. In Egypt, it was Mira, which means loves Ra. You go to Orkney Island in Scotland, and one of the key sites is the Bay of Scale, Sakael. It means celebrates El. El was a god of space who came out of the Near East, out of the Canaanite tradition.
Wow, that just brings all of it so together, like the same,
right?
The same way of formulating it. Yeah.
Right, and so there are these little signatures that are being applied all the time that insist that this group had to have been influenced by the same tradition.
Yeah. Wow. It just keeps going. So another thing I had, so I just have some of these, like you had talked about the vulture, like different animals, like, because the Chinese have the 12 animals for the, that are the symbols for the years and the months and the days and all of that.
Right.
But they don't have anything like a vulture.
Okay. One of the goals of this instruction was to keep it very highly mnemonic. Mnemonic meaning that the mnemonics are devices that make it easy to remember a thing. I'll give you an easy example of what a mnemonic is. When my wife Risa and I had our children were very young, we were planning to take them to a county fair. But we thought, if these kids get separated from us in some way, they have no ability to tell anybody where they live or who their parents are or what their phone number is. How are we ever going to find them if we get separated from them? So we taught them to sing their address and their phone number to children's tunes in response to the question, where do you live? What's your address? What's your phone number? They would sing the song back. Now, what we've discovered is that friends we had back in the day when we invented these little songs to this day remember our address that way. We had a friend a few months back who said, I wanted to send you a package, but I realized I didn't have your address with me. And then I thought, oh, I can just sing the song.
Oh, that's such a good one. They should be learning in pre-K.
So the idea was that we had a civilizing plan for society that was focused on skills of agriculture that was tagged to the symbolic cosmology, which is science.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that any tribal person, when they stepped out of their hut in the morning, would be surrounded by things in their daily life that would remind them of what they had been taught. And so in any given region, they tried to pick animal and plant symbols that were going to be found in that region. So in the Americas, the serpent symbol is a rattlesnake. In India, it's a cobra. Mm-hmm. In other places, it might be a different snake symbol.
Right.
So you sort of have equivalent, like you have lions representing certain concepts in places like Ireland and China. When you get to South America, it's a puma who's representing the same concept. So this is tailored to the environment that the students were going to go back to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I know the vulture was big in Egypt, and it's also in Göbekli Tepe, right?
Right. Now, when they selected the animal to represent a concept, they tried to pick an animal with an obvious attribute that related to the thing they were trying to symbolize. Mm-hmm. For instance, when they were talking about trying to symbolize the concept of vibration, they chose a rabbit or a hare because it twitches.
Uh-huh.
Okay. When we're dealing with the energetics, we're talking about the superconductive domain where magnetism is dormant, mm-hmm. that the fundamental act that is attributed to the equivalent of a creator god in the Dogon system. They don't really have a concept of deity. They're talking about science. You can tell that from the names they pick. The fundamental act was pulling together two monopoles of energy to produce a magnet. A magnet grasps, it holds firm, and it establishes.
Oh.
And the talons of a bird of prey are the way of symbolizing that, because that's what those talons do.
Uh-huh.
And so in some cultures, that's a falcon. In other cultures, it's a hawk. From culture to culture, it varies. There might be in South America, it's an entirely different bird of prey.
Mm-hmm. But that's the one that you had to grasp.
Right.
Talking about to grasp, yeah.
Right. So that's, to my way of understanding, that's the root of the symbolism of the falcon. But there are other attributes it has also. For example, back in the day, it was used sort of like carrier pigeons to carry a message someplace and to come back. These falcons could be trained to deliver messages. Mm-hmm. And so there are ancient Egyptian words that have to do with communicating a message where the symbol is the falcon.
Oh. So they were using them way back for sending messages.
Right.
Okay. And then I looked at, I was just looking at the different animals, but there is a fox, although it's not one of the chosen astrological animals of the year, the month. But the fox, you said something somewhere. I'm just bringing this, like related to altars. Did you say that?
Okay, I'll try to explain what the fox symbol represents. Okay. The idea is we have two domains, one that's energetic and the other one is material.
Right.
And at the boundary between the two domains, energy overturns. Mm-hmm. And the way it overturns is all the dynamics are very familiar to us. It doesn't matter what scale you observe the dynamics of energy on. There's a handful of clusters of dynamics of energy that just keep repeating in similar form all the way up. Mm-hmm. So what happens at this boundary between energy and matter is the same thing that happens when you see a hurricane spin. A hurricane will spin and hollow out sort of a boat-shaped hollow of water in the ocean water.
Mhm.
And that's what the Dogon say energy does. It creates this boat-shaped structure that they refer to as the arc of Ogo, or the arc of light, or the arc of energy.
Ah.
And that's understood to then overturn. And when it overturns, instead of being a boat, it's now configured a structure that's more like a seed, but it's still floating on water like a boat.
Mhm.
And because the shape of the structure resembles the tail of a fox, the fox becomes its symbol. There's another reason also, because the prow of the boat is slightly higher than the tail of the boat, and so it ends up resembling the figure of the fox.
Wow.
So
That.
so the fox is symbolic of the earliest stages of materiality, whereas that almond-shaped seed, which is the Vesica Pisces,
Mhm.
is a symbol of the coming together of non-material and material energies. That's why it's a symbol. It becomes a symbol of deity in later religions.
Well, because I know the fox for the Chinese, it had different, but it was usually the afterlife or the spirit.
Right,
So
because
it's exactly
afterlife
like you're saying.
afterlife involves crossing that boundary between materiality and non-materiality.
Mm-hmm.
And so approaching it from the material side, the fox is a symbol of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then when we had, so it's just for a few more of these animals, like the elephant, like Ganesha, why was that an elephant? Why did they use the elephant for the Ganesha as a symbol?
Okay, this gets a little complicated. The symbol, okay, we understand what the symbolism of Ganesha is, because the Dogon, when they are talking about science,
Mm-hmm.
are representing structures whose attributes hit on all the icons of Ganesha. They aren't talking about Ganesha, they're talking about science. But when you start comparing the words they use to the words that are used in Hinduism, and the drawings they make compared to the ones that are presented in Hinduism and so forth, you realize that it's the same concepts being described, that Ganesha's symbolism rests on this cluster of root dynamics I was talking about. It pertains to how energy spins and how resonance and resistance cause vectors of energy to then be emitted. Okay. And there's certain factors in that process that when you graph them, look like the shape of the head of an elephant.
Oh.
Now, originally, when you start spinning the energy, the center point of spinning energy, which is that sun glyph shape, the circle with a dot, right, that center point is treated like the head. But as energy spins and you create these more complicated structures, suddenly this graph of the moment of inertia of spinning energy, which looks like an elephant's head, has replaced the role of that center point of spinning energy. And so you get the myth of Ganesha, who was born with one head and then it was cut off and replaced with another head. Oh. Now,
he was born with both times elephant head?
Say that again.
Both times were an elephant head?
The scientific graph suggested an elephant head. And both times, yeah, in the Hindu myth for Ganesha, the second head was an elephant's head. The first head, they don't specify. Presumably, the suggestion is that Ganesha was born, fashioned as a doll to look like a human. So he would have had a human's head to begin with. Oh. And then through a misunderstanding, his father, Shiva, ends up cutting the head off. And then he didn't know who Ganesha was. He didn't realize that Ganesha was his own son.
Right.
And so he sends his minions out to try to find a head to replace Ganesha's head. And they discover a wise old aging white elephant who says, "Look, I'm very near death anyway. Why don't you just take my head?" And that becomes Ganesha's
I never heard this myth before. It's a good one.
Well, one of the things I did, I wrote a book on Ganesha called Ganesha, the Scientific Symbolism of a Hindu God.
Uh-huh.
And one of my purposes in writing the book was I realized that I had enough of an overview of the symbolism of Ganesha and of the various creation myths of Ganesha and how the language worked and how the symbolism worked, to reformulate that myth in the way, according to a set of rules that I think applied, and then produce a storyline that I believe should be close to what the original myth looked like.
Uh-huh.
So that's really the thrust of that book, is to set down what all the symbolism of Ganesha is, relate that back to the Dogon tradition and to the science, and then to arrive at a point where we can now reformulate this myth and understand what they were talking about in the myth.
Mm-hmm. This is so complex.
Yeah, it gets complicated. Now, there's another very important symbolism to the elephant. This gets a little complicated also. I was confused at first when I was looking at ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, because I discovered they had two separate glyphs to represent the concept of time. I thought, why would you need two glyphs to represent the concept of time? Well, the reason is because there are two modes of time. One mode that is applicable on the energetic side, and another mode that's applicable on the linear side, on the material side. And the non-material mode of time is an oscillation back and forth, and the linear aspect of time is linear. It's sequential, that events happen in a particular order, and it's a sequential development of time. So one of the very important things in understanding the energetics is relating how those two modes of time relate to each other, trying to reconcile those two modes of time. And so working with references on Orkney Island, I realized that the geography of the island itself, the island is set across a short expanse of water from two elephant-shaped mountains with a gap in between them.
Oh.
Now, the way it's situated geographically, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west behind those mountains. And if you watch it every day, you can watch the mountain or the sun, the setting sun, shift northward till the winter solstice and then back southward again till the summer solstice. You have visualization of an agricultural calendar. You can understand, predict when the seasons are coming, but you've also reconciled these two modes of time. The solstice sunset on Orkney falls squarely between those two mountains.
Wow.
Now, that prior to the Orkney era, that same technique was being used in certain places, but it was always against a single sleeping elephant mountain. You go to Elephantine Island in Egypt at 4000 BC, and you have a view of what looks like a reclining elephant, and the sun sets directly behind it. I've seen texts that were sent in the past couple of years by residents on Elephantine Island saying, well, we know that summer's about to arrive because we can see where the sun's setting behind the mountain.
Yeah.
The same thing happens on Malta, from a site called Hagar Quim, which is a megalithic site. There's a megalithic window, a stone window that's raised to give you a visibility on an island called Fielfla. And Fielfla was home to caves in which they found pygmy elephant skeletons. But through this window, you can observe the sunset behind the island of Fielfla, in the same way that I was talking about at Elephantine or on Orkney. So they were practicing the same ritual of it's agricultural calendar that helped them plant their crops at the right time and harvest them at the right time and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
In Hinduism, after the Orkney era, Hinduism says that important sites were deliberately chosen because of their proximity to two mountains with a gap in between them. If you go to Egypt at around 2900 BC, just a couple of hundred years after the Orkney era, you find Abydos established in view of two elephant-shaped mountains with a gap in between them. And Om Seti, who was a famous figure who lived most of her life in Abydos, said that Abdu meant the desired mountain. In other words, they picked the site because of the proximity to the mountain. As a matter of fact, the gap between the mountains at Abydos is what's referred to as the Valley of Death. This is the shadow of Valley of Death stuff.
Oh.
Because the idea was that when the pharaoh died, his soul passed through those mountains as a kind of gateway and on to a second gateway in the east, which I presume was Orkney.
Oh, I see. It was that closely related.
Yes, and there are all sorts of elements at Abydos that are honorific of Orkney, down to the earliest burial chambers at a cemetery at Abydos of First Dynasty high dignitaries.
Mm-hmm.
The architecture of the burial chamber is a match for the architecture of the earliest stone houses on Orkney, a match for a stone house plan the Dogon presently make.
Yeah, because the Dogon, they have the same architectural plan.
Right. So,
based on the mother, right? The womb in the middle.
Well, the plan has symbolism. Okay, on Orkney, the researchers are confused because all of the original houses at the Skara Brae village on Orkney were built to the same plan, with a round room towards the top, a square room in the center, rectangular rooms on the sides, and a rectangular entryway at the bottom with a square hearth in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because the Dogon build to the same plan, and the Dogon say there's a reason for this, the architecture represents the body of a sleeping goddess or woman. The round room is her head. The square hearth in the center of the main room is her heart. The entryways are her sexual parts. The side rooms are her arms.
Mm-hmm.
Now on Orkney, the researchers have no idea what to make of it. They can't find any local connection to that architecture. They can't tie it to any Scandinavia or to nearby Europe or to any group they know to connect to Orkney. Mm-hmm. But it connects to Malta, where the sleeping goddess was found. As a matter of fact, when they found the cave, the Hall of the Sleeping Goddess, which is called Hal Saflieni on Malta, I have booklets written by the researchers who discovered the site. And they were saying one of our big confusions is that the term Hal Saflieni doesn't match the site. The site is entered through a village at the top of a hill, but in the language of Malta, the words Hal Saflieni mean low-lying village. Why would anybody name this low-lying village when you enter it from the top from a high-set village?
Right.
If instead you go to the ancient Faroese language on Orkney, you discover that Hal Saflieni means cave or hall of the sleeping one.
Wow. So Malta was so connected to that, and then it's connected to the Dogon and...
Yep. And virtually every founding element on Orkney at 3600 BC, we see in similar form on Malta just before that.
Wow.
Now, there's another interesting connection. There's a myth that comes out of the Near East about the god El, who was the god of space, to Yah's god of light. And El was originally associated with a female goddess named Asherah. She comes under several names in the Near East. But according to the myth, El and his consort got married. And when the wedding ceremony was over, she took her crown, which was a diadem, and tossed it up into the heavens, and it became the Corona Borealis, which is the constellation that looks like the shape of a crown.
Uh-huh.
Now, in the Aegean, on an island called Naxos, which is near Crete, there's a bay that's in that same shape called Corona, which means crown.
Mm-hmm.
On Orkney, just next to the Skara Brae village, there's a bay called the Bay of Skeal, which celebrates El, and it's in that same shape.
Wow.
And in the Faroese language on Orkney, they have two words for crown. One was skali, like scale, and the other was krona, like the word in the Aegean. Yeah. So from those references, we can infer that a group of initiates from the Aegean trained on Malta and then chose to go to Orkney to establish the site on Orkney.
And it's so interesting how they picked it so perfect. I mean, with all of they had to really look everywhere to get the perfect configuration of the mountains and.
Well, or else somebody more capable than them had already explained to them that those things were there. They just needed to send a group there.
Yeah. Okay.
What's also interesting is that the founding elements they brought to Orkney coincide with what's called an agricultural package that researchers in the Mediterranean, some of them flatly state that starting around 6000 BC, there was a deliberate effort to colonize the major islands of the Mediterranean for agriculture. And the group that came brought with them all these same elements that you see establishing Orkney 3,000 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can trace these societal elements. You have language, you have agricultural practices, you have symbolic elements, you have architecture, you have all sorts of other clusters of societal elements you can point to, then just follow them right across the Mediterranean, major island to major island to major island, to Malta, and then on to Orkney. And you can see evidences of them all the way up through the Hebrides next to England.
Wow, the connections. Do any of these others, like how the Dogon were able to see that Sirius was a binary star system? Did any of the others see that? Or is that?
Yes, that's one of the signatures of the tradition. There are different aspects of that become signatures, that any culture that imagines that there's a wheel or a chariot associated with Orion, there's no objective reason to think that. You look at Orion, you don't see anything that closely resembles a wheel.
Right.
So any culture that represents that to be true had to have gotten it from the same tradition the Dogon got it from.
Oh, I see.
Now, the purpose of these astronomical references is that we have a simple cluster of dynamics of energy that are evident at the scale of an atom. They're evident at the scale of larger, molecules, and they're evident in water. They're evident on all different levels, but they're also evident in the macrocosm in our area of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And so talking about the dynamics of the two stars of Sirius is a way of illustrating to us one of these dynamics of energy that's critical on all these other scales.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
That essentially, the Dogons say that the two Sirius stars and our sun emerge together, which is one of the dynamics of energy. And energy initially emerges in three monopoles. Those monopoles, two of them become a magnet, which is a proton, and one of them becomes an electron, and the electron moves out away from the proton and ends up circling it and creates a hydrogen atom.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Dogons say that our sun emerged with the Sirius stars and then moved out away from the Sirius stars and now circles it. And that's the source of what looks like to us like the precessional cycle, that 12,000 year cycle is an actual orbit. And that's why the Sirius stars don't seem to precess. Science says precession is a result of a wobble of the Earth. But any child who ever rode on a merry-go-round knows, in a park, knows that if you're the one spinning, absolutely everything around you spins. There can't be anything that doesn't spin except the kid who's at the center of the merry-go-round. He doesn't spin. Mm-hmm. So the Dogon perspective is that the Sirius stars sit at the center of a rotation the same way a proton does in a hydrogen atom, and that our sun is moving in the same way that an electron moves in a hydrogen atom.
Well, I'm so glad I asked you that question. I never heard that before. That's really interesting. Mm-hmm. I have one more question before we go. This has been like, wow, it's gone really fast. So let me, I'd asked you this once, but I wanted to on here, like, let's get rid of that. Whoops, I can't. They put the all of the stuff over my pictures.
Not good.
Okay, well, here's one, kind of. Oh, this is the handbags.
Right.
And here's that. So these are everywhere, like everywhere they find, no matter which culture, they're finding these handbags. And then when they got to Göbekli Tepe, they even had them just by themselves like that. And so I think you had told me that it's the symbol of heaven and earth. Is that it?
The symbolism gets a little complicated. Okay, a sanctuary, I told you that the dynamics of energy rests on the idea of non-material energy and material energy coming together.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the creational dynamics rely on, is that that's the catalyst for creating matter and for creating life and for creating consciousness.
Okay.
The Göbekli Tepe site is a sanctuary, and the original definition of a sanctuary was a place where non-material and material energy comes together. And so you have a range of symbolic elements at Göbekli Tepe that all express that idea. We know they do because symbols survived in different traditions.
Mm-hmm.
We know that reconciling a circular shape with a square shape, which is the shape of that handbag, mm-hmm. is one way of representing those two energies coming together.
Oh, I see. Okay.
You have all sorts of other elements at Göbekli Tepe that represent the same thing. I had been talking about the oscillation of energy being like the solstice dynamic of the sun. Mm-hmm. We have the vulture sitting there with its wings spread out and the sun at the end of its wing, representing the concept of solstice.
Oh, yeah.
We have we actually even have a little picture of two elephants there representing the concept of a male and female Ganesha, which represent that same idea. We have all sorts of other elements at Göbekli Tepe that all repeat the same thing. I was saying that the mindset was to express things in multiple ways, hoping that one of them would stick with the future audience. That's what they're doing there. Mm-hmm. Now, beyond that, okay, you've got groups like the Maori in New Zealand at a much later date who preserve a myth where one of the departmental gods named Tane ascends to the gods and returns with 3 handbags of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So the handbag is symbolic of the teaching of that knowledge. Mm-hmm. But if you go even beyond that, we have UFO encounters that involve beings carrying little bags like that, just like that. In the modern version, the handle lights up.
You said that, and it's amazing. Like, and do you think that it's a bag? Do you think there's anything inside of it, or it's just symbolic?
That's hard to tell because it's hard to distinguish what's being presented as a symbolic reference and what's being represented literally.
Right.
And it's only over time that you reach a point where finally the right puzzle piece falls into place and you know this must be literal. But sometimes it's even more curious than that. For example, in China, mm-hmm. we have myths that pertain to a group of quasi-mythical emperors or leaders of China back in the ancient times who were the bringers of civilizing skills. Mm-hmm. Now, all of these cosmological terms I work with, every word carries a cluster of meanings. As an example, in Turkey, in a modern Turkish dictionary, the word tepe, like Göbekli Tepe, carries 25 different meanings. Wow. If you go to an ancient Egyptian dictionary, you can find 12 of those meanings represented with a similar phonetic. Mm-hmm. The clusters of meanings are inherent to these words. So those clusters of meanings they get represented in other ways. They're a function, to my way of thinking, of crossing of the boundary between non-materiality and materiality. The easy example is white light that produces the colors of a rainbow. That's the dynamic crossing the boundary between non-materiality and materiality. Anything that expresses itself in terms of those clusters of meanings. To get back to the emperors in China, if you take any one of these myths of an emperor in China, you discover that the facts that are being related in the myth, the place where the emperor was born, the places he traveled, the things he's remembered for accomplishing, the civilizing skill he was said to have brought, all of these play out in terms of the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary as multiple meanings of a single phonetic, and that phonetic is the emperor's name.
Oh.
Okay, so for a researcher like myself looking at these, I say, well, clearly these must be mythological, not historical, because people's lives don't play out that way.
Yeah.
This must be a story.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that through a set of a couple of odd meanings, it was pointed out to me that the same symbolic elements that I've been researching have similar kinds of pertinence to my own life. That somebody researching Laird Scranton 500 years from now is going to discover that these references keep coming closer and closer and closer and closer to things that pertain to me specifically. For example, the Scarabray village was uncovered on land that was owned by the Laird of Scale. By the time we get there, we're down to my actual name, but it passes through names of people who are close to me and people I've known in life and places I've lived and where I went to school, and all these different aspects of my life play out in terms of terms that have cosmological importance to the system I'm studying.
Right.
So it may well be that life actually does play out that way. We just don't notice it.
Well, you're just becoming the whole system.
No, but it's not just me. I mean, very often I'll be researching a particular topic and someone in the community of sort of interestingly connected people I know will contact me and say, oh, by the way, I had a dream last night and this and this and this and this happened. And I discovered when I researched their dream that it points me to an aspect of the thing I'm looking into that I didn't know existed.
It's like in physics, the basin of attraction, right? How it works like that.
Yeah, or maybe it works more like back in the day with television where there were only 3 networks.
Yeah.
The chances of any given person watching the same show was pretty high. So it could be there's just a single download happening and that all sorts of different people tap into that download in their own way.
Well, this is a good place to end this because I'm going to have to watch it again. There was so much more information. I'm so thankful you agreed to do another interview. So thank you.
Sure, I'm happy to talk anytime. Your questions are very good ones.
Okay. So everyone, will see you for the second interview in the Year of the Dark Water Rabbit in a week or two. So that's, where is it here?